Thank you. The next item of business is a Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee debate, motion 19553 in the name of Joan McAlpine on the Glasgow School of Art fire. Can I ask those who want to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And I call on Joan McAlpine to speak to and move the motion. Ms McAlpine, please.
Thank you. On behalf of the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee, I welcome the opportunity to debate the committee's report, The Glasgow School of Art Mackintosh Building, the Loss of a National Treasure. Situated at the heart of the Glasgow School of Art's Garnet Hill campus, the Mackintosh building was widely considered to be one of Charles Rennie Mackintosh's seminal achievements. First conceived by the artist in 1896, the building is recognised as an architectural masterpiece of international significance. On the night of the 15th of June 2018, the Mackintosh building suffered a second catastrophic fire, which caused significant damage to the building's interior as well as the exterior facades and gables. More than 120 firefighters were called to tackle the blaze, which spread to a neighbouring music venue, the O2 ABC, and caused severe disruption to residents and businesses in the surrounding area. The committee's report, published in March, sought to understand how one of Scotland's greatest architectural achievements, indeed artistic achievements, could suffer two catastrophic fires while under the custodianship of the Glasgow School of Art. What lessons might be learned, we asked, and what steps could be taken to protect Scotland's built heritage in the future? I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all those who provided evidence to the committee and to our clerks who worked so hard on the inquiry and the report. Having weighed the information provided to us in evidence, the committee concluded that there was a clear need for a wider public inquiry to take place, one which had judicial powers to get to the bottom of what happened to this iconic building. At the time, the committee specified that this should only take place once the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service had reported on the fire, and we look forward to the Fire Service's findings, although I understand the frustrations of those who are still waiting for answers. I share those frustrations. The issues considered by the committee in its report go way beyond the cause of the fire itself and examine the wider failings which provided the context for the first fire, the measures taken to avoid the second, and the wider impact on the local community. That is why the committee remains of the view that a full public inquiry is the only means to fully understand the events which led to these devastating fires. Yes.
Adam Tompkin.
I'm very grateful to the member for taking intervention. Does the member agree with me that the public inquiry, which I agree should be held, should look not only backwards at what happened in 2018 and why it happened, but also forwards at what should happen to the building in the future? And that the management of the Glasgow School of Art have proved themselves to be an unfit custodian of this national treasure, and that the public inquiry must consider whether the building and its future should be taken out of the GSA's hands and laid in some sort of public trust.
Joan McAlpine, you have all your time back.
Thank you. I wouldn't want to preempt the public inquiry, but I would say that our own report did look forward and say that the decision on the future management of the building in terms of its purpose and how it was rebuilt shouldn't be for the Glasgow School of Art Management alone, and it should involve a wider consultation, not just with the local community, but actually right across all layers of government in Scotland. I would also say that Glasgow School of Art may be an independent institution, but is one that's in receipt of substantial public funds, and is absolutely right that we scrutinise the decisions that it's made in regard to how those funds are spent. Historic buildings like the Mackintosh are awarded their Category A listed status because they can be characterised as sites of unique historical or architectural interest. Often, it is these inimitable features which make these buildings so susceptible to the risks posed by fires. While the risk posed by fire can never be entirely mitigated, the committee sought to understand the GSA's approach to the management of risk and to ascertain if, having identified specific risks to the Mackintosh building, the school had taken proportionate measures to adequately manage those risks. When considering the GSA's custodianship of the building, what the committee found most concerning was the art school's understanding of the potential risks posed to the building, but also the length of time that the GSA had known about these risks and the steps that they had taken to mitigate them. Fire safety expert Stuart Kidd raised concerns in writing about the risks posed by fire as far back as the mid-1990s when he visited the building with Historic Scotland. Commenting in his written evidence to the committee, he described parts of the building as working very like an effective chimney. And this is one of the very many concerns raised by the fire safety experts and GSA alumni who gave us evidence. And it was a great concern that the voids identified by Stuart Kidd back in the 1990s were found to be the cause of the rapid fire spread in 2014 by the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service when they identified that panels had been left off these voids, which allowed the fire to spread just as it would through a chimney. And we also took evidence that these voids were still not blocked during the restoration last year, and that was evidence according to the Glasgow School of Art's own architects. In 2006, Glasgow School of Art commissioned Borough Happold to conduct a fire protection strategy to review what it called feasible options for the long-term protection of the occupant's property and contents of the Macintosh building. In the report, Borough Happold emphasised the risk of fire to the Macintosh building and stated that due to the historic nature and value of the property, many of its contents, fire possesses a great threat. Despite reassurances provided by the GSA about the building being compliant with the relevant fire standards, the committee took the view that given the significance of the building, the way in which it had been used by students and risks clearly identified by Borough Happold and others, the GSA appears not to have addressed specifically the heightened risk of fire to the building. The GSA have argued that their decision to install a mist suppression system following the outcome of a property protection study carried out in 2008 demonstrates their commitment to the building's safety. But despite these good intentions, the suppression system had not been installed by the time of the 2014 fire. So why then did it take so long to install the mist suppression system, something that may well have prevented the spread of the first fire in 2014? And it should be said, of course, if there hadn't been a fire in 2014, the building would not have been destroyed in 2018. In response to questions from the committee regarding the length of time taken for the installation of the system, the GSA stated that the timescale for implementation of the system was attributable to two key factors, namely funding and the discovery of asbestos. According to the GSA, once they had obtained approval in principle to install the suppression system, they had to secure funding. Following unsuccessful claims to Historic Environment Scotland and the Heritage Lottery Fund, the GSA initiated its own fundraising exercise. Fire safety experts described the use of fundraising by the GSA to fund a safety-critical system like the fire suppression system to be unusual, and the committee questioned whether more could have been done given the well-documented risks. When the committee questioned why funds couldn't have been secured from other bodies, like Historic Environment Scotland, to support the installation of the system, Dr Muriel Gray explained the suppression system was deemed an enhancement and funds could therefore not be secured through other means other than fundraising. And the committee finds it remarkable that having identified the risk to one of Scotland's most iconic buildings, the art school were forced to fundraise for funds to appropriately protect it. And furthermore, the committee remains concerned that sufficient steps weren't taken to mitigate the risks in the interim to ensure the building's safety. The committee therefore recommended that the Scottish Government undertake an assessment of whether the current funding models available to higher education institutions to protect historic assets, such as the Macintosh, are adequate, and the Scottish Government, through its agencies, review the adequacy of powers to compel owners to put in place enhanced fire safety measures to protect buildings of national significance. The committee was therefore pleased, following the publication of the report, that the Cabinet Secretary instructed officials to review the adequacy of powers to compel owners to put in place enhanced fire safety measures in the context of A-listed buildings. One area of particular concern raised by the conservation architect Dawson Stelfox was the need to better protect historic buildings like the MAC during their restoration. He said a focus on the importance of the historical building asset and a fire risk assessment is currently lacking in the guidance and legislation. We need to think about how we use fire safety measures and audits to protect the historic fabric in the long term. That is not a requirement at the moment. When the committee asked Historic Environment Scotland about this perceived gap in the statutory position with regards to the protection of assets during the construction, they acknowledged that increasingly there is an understanding with the historic environment and with collections associated with buildings such as museums that there is a need to protect those assets in their own right. Accordingly, the committee recommend that the Scottish Government reviews, in consultation with relevant stakeholders, the legislation concerning safety in historic buildings during the construction phase of a project in order to identify any additional legislative measures that could be put in place to protect them. There is also considerable concern expressed in the committee report at the treatment of the local community by the GSA after both fires. And our report recommended that more community engagement should take place, as I said earlier to Mr Tompkins, that decisions on the rebuild of the GSA and the use of the building in future should not be for GSA management alone. We haven't said too much in the report about the 2018 fire because the report from Scottish Fire and Rescue Service is not yet out. But I would want to put on record that the committee was concerned that we didn't see the fire plan and that we were told that the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service had signed off the fire plan only for the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service to then write to us to deny this. We were also concerned at the inability of the contractor to tell us if the fire alarm was operational on the night of the fire. And we were also concerned about the amount of activity taking place in the MACs, and particularly social activities, during the restoration. However, we will have to wait and see the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service's report before we draw any conclusions from any of that. The committee welcomes some of the progress made by the Scottish Government to address the issues identified in the committee's report, and I hope this will lead generally to greater protections for Scotland's iconic buildings. And although we await the results of the SFRS report into the 2018 fire, we as a committee believe strongly that this will provide us with only part of the story. This is not about attributing blame, it's about learning lessons so that as a country we can ensure our built heritage can be enjoyed by future generations. And I and the committee therefore hope that the Scottish Government will commit to holding a full public inquiry following the publication of the SPRS report. Thank you very much.
Could you please move the motion in your name?
I move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much. Can I say there are some members who apparently want to speak but haven't pressed the request to speak button, so I'm at a loss to know whether they're still in that position. Thank you very much. And now call on Richard Lockhead to open for the Government. Minister.
I'd like to start by commending Joan McAlpine, the convener, and of course her colleagues on the committee for the substantial and thorough report and for bringing this debate to Parliament today. I believe that all of us here do recognise the immense cultural significance of the Macintosh building, and indeed, as Peter Capaldi said after the fire in 2014, there is no greater symbol of the artistic spirit of Scotland than the Macintosh building. That is why it's so important that Parliament does have the opportunity to consider the committee's findings, which reflect on the GSA's management of the Macintosh restoration site and the lessons that might now be learnt. As Joan McAlpine outlined, I'm sure we all remember the dreadful events which led to the committee's inquiry. The nation was rocked by the first fire back in 2014. And all of Scotland, all of Civic Scotland in particular, but indeed people beyond Scotland, came together to support the GSA in its ambition to rebuild. We watched with admiration the careful, skillful and specialist work needed to bring this icon back to its former glory. And just as the completion of that work seemed within touching distance, the tragedy of the second, much more destructive fire shook us all once more. Again, the impact was felt worldwide. But in all of this, I think it's important to remember the immediate and brutal impact on the GSA staff and their students. And of course, as others will mention, also to their neighbours in the Garnet Hill community as well. And I want to pay tribute to all of these people, to the residents and businesses for their patience and resilience in the face of extraordinary difficulties, to the GSA staff for picking themselves up once more for facing the renewed and ever greater challenge and throughout of maintaining their core purpose, which is to provide a top quality learning experience for over 2,000 students. Yeah.
Adam Tompkins.
Very grateful to the Minister for taking an intervention. Does the Minister agree that the GSA have not, the GSA management have not only allowed this iconic building to burn down twice in the space of 4 years, but in the aftermath of the 2018 fire, they treated their neighbours in the Garnet Hill community that he was just referring to, both residents and businesses up and down Sauchiehall Street, with disdain and contempt. And you put all of this together, is it not the Minister's view that the time has long since passed for the Macintosh building to be taken out of the hands of the GSA and placed into public trust?
Minister.
Although I would not necessarily share the same language as Adam Tompkins uses, I would certainly say that there are some harsh lessons to be learnt. And the Glasgow School of Art and their management, who indeed I met yesterday, are the first to admit that there are lessons to learn in terms of how they communicated with the local community following the fire. And they have taken steps to try and address some of these concerns. Indeed, they are working in a closer relationship with the local community. They now host meetings of the Community Council, and they've appointed effectively a liaison officer to work to bring the school and the local community together as well. So I think there are, of course, lessons to be learnt in that area. Can I also say, of course, we are indebted to the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, who responded quickly on the night of the fire, arriving at the scene less than 5 minutes after the alarm was raised. And firefighters were faced with a well-developed fire, but despite their best efforts, were unable to prevent the spread of the fire to these neighbouring properties. And of course, without that quick response from the fire service, this fire could have spread much further than it did. So incidents like this major fire remind us of the sheer bravery of these firefighters who are willing to put themselves in danger to assist others. And again, I'm sure we want to take the opportunity, as Joan McAlpine did as well, to thank our firefighters and indeed the staff, both on scene and in the operations control room at the time. It is, of course, also important to note that the Glasgow School of Art's got a very important position locally, nationally and across the world. We may think, of course, as we do, that the MAC is what we picture when we think of the GSA, but the school itself has recognised the value of the building as a teaching venue. It is also so clearly more than just a building. The outpouring of dismay so evident in the wake of these two tragedies is testament to the fact it was not just simply a building. So it's important to remember that the school is primarily a functioning higher education institution. And as I said before, I met the chair and the acting director yesterday, who impressed upon me their determination to continue to deliver excellent creative education and contribute creatively to the government's ambitions as well. Despite the extreme and ongoing pressure on GSA, they do continue to achieve, and I congratulate them that just after 3 months after the second fire, they were successfully able to begin the new academic year. And more recently, the renovated Stowe building, which again I had the opportunity to visit, opened to students, providing accommodation for the School of Fine Arts. But I am also conscious of the GSA's wider impact on the economic life of Glasgow and Scotland. It is, of course, an intrinsic part of the cultural and economic life of the city. And students and staff contribute to the exhibitions, the festivals and events across the city and in Garnet Hill, of course, itself, and often go on to settle in the local community and build businesses locally as well. And of course, let's not forget, GSA is ranked in the top 10 art and design institutions in the QS World University Rankings for 2019, underlining its enviable international status. But the focus of this debate, as we know, is the findings of the committee's reports in relation to the MAC. And there is indeed much the committee's report highlights and gives us all to reflect upon. References to the GSA's approach to risk management, which was not being sufficiently robust, and that the board did not have the expertise required to tackle such a complex project, and it questions some of the decisions taken, for example, an installation of the mist suppression system. So these are some of the issues, and Joan McAlpine covered others raised in the report. Now, of course, it is for the Glasgow School of Art, as an autonomous body and as the owner of the Macintosh building, to respond to these matters. And of course it has done so. Likewise, the future use of the MAC is a decision for the school. The board has made clear its intention to rebuild the current site, and that the MAC should return as a fully functioning art school. That's why I welcome the Glasgow School of Art's commitment to improving engagement with the local community, which will continue to be of vital importance as they develop and take forward and refine their plans. Now, the Cabinet Secretary for Culture, Tourism and External Affairs, who's sitting next to me, has responded to the committee's recommendations for both the Government and for Historic Environment Scotland officially. And what is clear is that we should seek to learn from the events of June 2018 and do what we can to help prevent similar events happening in the future. We will look at the options for a fire mitigation review and of powers to intervene in fire safety in the context of listed buildings in public and major institutional ownership. We have also agreed to take a very focused look at Historic Environment Scotland's statutory remit in relation to fire mitigation in buildings of outstanding special architectural or historic interest. And government officials are currently working on this in close liaison with their colleagues from Environment Scotland. In addition, the agency will review and strengthen its guidance on the risks to buildings during conservation and renovation work and its technical guidance and fire safety management. So that work will take into account the findings of the SFRS investigation once it's complete. The Government will also await the investigation's outcome before considering further the Committee's recommendation to establish a public inquiry. So it's important to note as I reach a conclusion that ministers have no direct role in directing decisions made by the boards of Scottish higher education institutions. However, the Scottish Funding Council does have a role in supporting the school in its core function of delivering high-quality teaching and learning and ensuring there is suitable provision for its governance and management. And I am pleased that in the face of the extreme pressures faced by the school, that the Scottish Funding Council has stepped up its engagement with the board and senior management team to ensure the high level of governance that we do expect in their higher education institutions, and we expect that to be adhered to is in fact the case, and also to support staff and students during what has been a very difficult time. There's also been 5 new board members appointed by the board at GSA, and they will also appoint a permanent director of estates as well, and other positions that hopefully will improve things going forward at the same time and give them the necessary skills. So in closing, I thank the committee once more for its report and for focusing on reducing as far as possible the risk of another disaster, the likes of which we have seen at GSA, and I'm sure colleagues across the chamber will join me in commending the committee for its important work. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to the Culture Committee for their work and bringing this to the Chamber today. The Charles Rennie Mackintosh building stood as a beautiful symbol for the best of Scottish art and design. Its most famous feature was its library, which housed many rare and archival materials, as well as original furniture and fittings. It was so heartbreaking, and we'll hear that, I'm sure, from many colleagues today, to watch the Grade A listed Glasgow School of Art, affectionately known as the MAC, destroyed by fire for a second time on the night of the 15th of June 2018. The community of Glasgow and beyond were devastated by the fire that night, as well as everyone across Scotland, and the impact it continues to have. Businesses and local residents still withstand the worst of the consequences of that fire, and that is why it is so important that in the future the local community are treated with respect and consulted and engaged in future processes. I want to pay tribute to those who helped that night, from the fire service to the police. Their efforts ensured that we did not see further damage done. Importantly, I also want to pay tribute to those who lost work during the fire, artists and restorers who worked tirelessly and meticulously to replicate beautiful Rennie Mackintosh pieces, tragically lost their great work, not only that night, but also in the first fire too. Whilst we await the conclusion of the SFRS report, we know fundamentally that historic buildings do require special attention during works, and the delayed installation of a water mist suppression system and presence of obsolete ventilation ducts exacerbated the 2 fires at the school. In the run-up to the first fire in 2014, the GSA appeared not to have specifically addressed the heightened fire risk to the MAC building. It was concerned about the length of time taken for a mist suppression system to be installed and questioned whether more could have been done in the interim period to protect the building. Then in 2018, in the fire, it could not determine whether the fire alarm system was switched on and fully operational. Presiding Officer, my colleagues on the Scottish Conservative benches were clear from the outset. There has to be a full public inquiry into the fire. Adam Tompkins made this abundantly clear in February when he stated, and I quote, "A public inquiry could compel the disclosure of information in the same way that a court can compel the release of documents in civil proceedings." We cannot let damage on this magnitude happen again to any other prestigious listed building. ultimately lessons have to be learned. There are hundreds of listed buildings going through restoration at any given time, and to simply wish that something similar would not happen again would be preposterous. And I was glad that this was touched upon in the committee report. We need to see all stakeholders involved, getting round the table to ensure that our historic buildings, whether castles, stately homes, civic buildings, are properly protected at all times, not just during restoration or construction. The committee was right to call for a review to all the appropriate pieces of legislation that correspond to listed buildings. We need to see the Scottish Government, the Scottish Fire and Rescue Services and Historic Environment Scotland review fire safety procedures in Category A listed buildings. This could be done in line with ensuring the Scottish Government reviews the legal protections for Category A listed buildings. If these historic and valuable buildings are to be safely restored and maintained, there needs to be better regulations in place to ensure that contractors are respecting the unique characteristics of these buildings. And I look forward to the Minister in his close acknowledging these points. And I believe the best way forward is also to better educate owners and contractors on the unique nature of listed historic buildings and the distinct set of problems that they can pose when carrying out reportative work. Owners must be up to date with installing fire safety measures, and that was also a point raised by the committee, but also have fire action plans in place to ensure that if a fire does break out, there are appropriate mitigation measures in place to hinder the spread of the fire. And whilst I acknowledge the committee's recommendations that HES need to update that guidance to ask for better compartmentation of historic buildings to hinder the spread of the fire, I also believe that this must be done sympathetically and not to detriment the historical value of those buildings in question. I also agree with the committee that we may need to focus our attention on categorisation of buildings. Whilst A-grade list buildings command the highest level of protection, does it really ensure they are safe and are equipped to deal with fires and other disasters? And should specific protections be extended to those of unique cultural and historical significance, rather than just those in the Category A? Fundamentally, Presiding Officer, we do need better guidance, we need better legislation and better protection for our historic buildings in order that we do not see this happen again. What took place at the Glasgow School of Art back in June 2018 will remain a constant reminder that historic buildings require special attention during restoration and construction works. Whilst the failings in the run-up to the fire cannot be simply narrowed down to one single issue, it's important that we recognise the report on the cause of the fire has not yet been established by the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, though investigations are said to be in their final phase. I share the comments of the committee that after the conclusion of the SFRS report, the Scottish Government should establish a public inquiry with judicial powers into the 2014 and the 2018 fires at the MAC. And as I pointed out earlier, we've been clear on this since day one. The transparency of the GSA management must also be scrutinised. The inquiry should look at the risks and susceptibility of historic buildings, of fires, and the need for greater support, guidance, legislation and protection on how to ensure we do not see devastating fires such as this one in the Glasgow School of Art that night in June last year. Thank you.
Pauline McNeill, 7 minutes, please.
First of all, I'd like to put on record my thanks to the committee and the committee convener, Joan McAlpine, who I believe had a forensic examination of the tragedy of the Glasgow School of Art fire. And I think that this committee report has to be commended as one of the most important reports I think that the Parliament has completed so far, because I think that the nature of it, and they got to the very bottom and the heart of some issues that still have to be answered. So I'd like to thank them for that. Because for the second time in 4 years, Glasgow School of Art was ablaze and Stucky Hall Street cordoned off. It was a tragedy for the School of Art itself, for those associated with it, those who love it, local businesses, I mean, the O2 is still devastated. We still don't know the future of that important music venue. And as been mentioned by others, Adam Tompkinson, who I've worked very closely with Adam on this issue, the community were totally devastated and still are devastated by this. Families are split up due to the difficulties in getting emergency accommodation. People returned to their homes on the night of the fire and were not allowed to return home for 4 months. They weren't even allowed to come in and collect personal belongings. So we can never underestimate the impact of this fire. But it did expose what is not just poor relationships between the local community and the Glasgow School of Art at the time of the fire. I think it's important to point out to the Cabinet Secretary that this is a relationship that has been very poor for a long period of time, and I think at least Grays on record is acknowledging that. And it can never be allowed to happen. It's such an important institution sitting in the middle of Garnet Hill in a residential community really needs to have an ongoing excellent relationship with local people. 33 businesses were devastated by the Glasgow School of Art fire, and they are still struggling today. Like Rachel Hamilton, I'd like to put on record my thanks to the 120 firefighters who fought through the blaze and to be commended for their incredible stamina and expertise in fighting this fierce and enormous fire. But if you ask any of the residents and business if they believe there was an adequate response from authorities, they will tell you that they felt abandoned by it. So you must learn lessons, not just about what caused the fire, we're still to learn of that, but also of the conduct of authorities during it. Because one of the important aspects of the committee's report and why the questions that they ask, I think, are so critical is because if you ask local people now, if they feel safe in their own homes, knowing that there have been 2 fires in Glasgow School of Art, they say they don't feel safe. And therefore, accountability for the fire and seeing and reading the fire service report and what caused it is absolutely fundamental, especially for those people. So the report, the committee report itself is damning on the Glasgow School of Art and what it can establish in the run-up to the fire. I wholeheartedly support the call for a public inquiry. In fact, I think it's absolutely essential, and I think it's disappointing that we don't yet have the fire report. I'm sure there are very good reasons for this. I did think that we would have it by now, and I think at the very least, I think we should know what the barriers, if there are any barriers for the conclusion of the report. I know that access to the site has been difficult, but it's 16 months on, and I think we need to have some indication of when that can be expected. So there were serious fire risks associated with a building of that nature, and it's a key part of the report that it identifies that special measures should have been taken and must be taken in a building of that kind. Lessons were not learned between the 2 fires, and like Rachel Hamilton, I found it quite astonishing to read in the committee report that they were not in a position to determine whether the fire alarm system was switched on the night of the fire. I had to read it 3 or 4 times to if I could read it correctly. Someone must be held to account for this. How is it possible for the leadership of Glasgow School of Art to come along and tell the committee or anyone else that they don't actually know whether the alarm was switched on? And it actually beggars belief. So there should be no question in the minds of the leadership of Glasgow School of Art, and I want to get to this point before I close, because the committee also did not mince its words when it came to the governance of Glasgow School of Art, and they said explicitly that it did not give sufficient priority to safeguarding of the Macintosh. Now, to me, that must give ministers serious concerns. Now, notwithstanding what the Cabinet Secretary said about the nature of it being the guardian of the Macintosh, it is a public institution. There must be ways in which ministers can say, well, we are not satisfied that you are the correct custodians of the Macintosh. You are a public institution and you have to be accountable. The lack of transparency regarding what measures they took in 2014 is another astonishing fact, only brought out by this committee report. It's quite unbelievable. You would like to think that after one fire, that the leadership could come to the committee and explicitly spell out what measures they were taking in order to make sure that it didn't happen again. They were unable to do so. It is clear in such cases that where a historic building such as the MAC has a dual function, it's obvious, I suppose, when you read it now, that there should have been additional support and guidance in recognition of the additional fire risk. There are odd elements to the story and the strategy. Fundraising for a sprinkler mist system, which was a necessity, not optional, gives out a strange message to the public about funding fire safety measures. And to me, what it points to is that the strategy of the leadership was all over the place, because there must have been another way of raising funds for for a system that was absolutely essential to protect the building. Like Adam Tompkins, I believe there's been a complete lack of leadership here, and I'm really dissatisfied at the lack of answers that we have on this. And I just want to raise some of them in closing. There's been a catalogue of errors. We still don't know why Tom Innes suddenly departed. Ministers should be asking, it is a public institution. Why did Tom Innes leave the Glasgow School of Art, and why did he leave so suddenly? Why are 6 staff members signing confidentiality agreements? What is this confidential information that they are protecting? Why were there payouts of £210,000? The dysfunctionality at the top of this institution should be unacceptable to ministers, unacceptable to Parliament, and it's certainly unacceptable to the general public. We have to get answers to this. This is an institution we all love. We want it to have a future. It must have a future. The public must be involved in the design. The community must be involved in all of it. But before we get to that stage, we must have answers as soon as possible as to why we are in this situation. Thank you.
Patrick Harvey, 6 minutes, please.
Forgive me, Presiding Officer, I didn't quite hear you. Thank you for calling me in the debate, and can I recognise the work that the committee has done in producing this report. I certainly want to begin by agreeing with the central conclusions in the committee report. Yes, indeed, that the public inquiry will be required, and I hope that the government, in responding to the debate, will give some explicit assurances on that. But also the conclusion that says that the issues raised in this report go well beyond the fire itself, its causes and its effects. So I want to say something about both of those. The issues in relation to the fire, first of all, I think other members have already quite clearly set out the shock, the almost sense of disbelief at some of what has been found in this inquiry. The sense that a fire suppression system not only wasn't in place, but had to be fundraised for in the way that it had. And the evidence that I think one of the fire safety experts that the committee heard from, who said they'd never heard of any other organisation having to fundraise for safety-critical infrastructure of this kind. I really do think that speaks to the extraordinary and exceptional circumstances that the GSA had found itself in. And I think that one of the questions that the committee raises, that again I would ask the government to respond to, is the fact that Historic Environment Scotland didn't have the power to mandate the fire prevention and other preservation measures that were required. The report does make some conclusions around this, and I think asks for the government to look at the overall remit of Historic Environment Scotland, and I hope that's something the Minister will reply to. But I wanted mostly to talk about the issues of context, because Glasgow School of Art is not just a building. Valued, iconic and important though it is also something that sits within a context. The written submission from the Displaced Residents Group, which the committee's report cites, includes one section which I'd like to read out. A long-standing resident writes, the only interaction with local residents has been Glasgow School of Art surveyors checking for movements and subsidence due to demolition and building works. We have never been included or invited to any of the degree shows or to see the buildings in the 28 years I've lived in Garnet Hill, though we've endured the disruption and the noise every day. And the residents group went on to say, the picture painted is of a selfish neighbour with little understanding of the impact they have on their community. We should be angry at that perception. We should note and acknowledge that the Glasgow School of Art recognised the validity of that perception. They accepted a lot of those criticisms. But this is a warning, I think, not just to the Glasgow School of Art, about the long and hard work they're going to have to do to rebuild trust. It should be a warning to all institutions, all large organisations, public, private or voluntary, that have a role in shaping the nature of the community that they live in and live alongside. Build that trust before you end up encountering a crisis. Because if you have to encounter a crisis, if you have to go through a situation, anything like that which the Glasgow School of Art and its community went through, it's too late to start building that trust then. It has to be done now. So I think that's a warning that everyone, not just the GSA and the organisations that are responsible for this situation, should be taking seriously. And the other aspect about context is not just about the local area, which clearly needs a proactive approach to the redevelopment of Sauchiehall Street. This should be a time, you know, where the Avenues project has taken Sauchiehall Street more back for public use, less space taken up by traffic and more for people. That should be a fantastic time, a renaissance time for Sauchiehall Street as a lively part of our city, and it should be something that's really positive. There has to be a plan that the government gets behind to ensure that kind of renaissance happens. But the wider context is also about the artistic and cultural life of our city and of our country. And it's at a time when, as Pauline McNeill reflects, it's not just the GSA, but the O2 as well. That's not so long after Glasgow lost the Arches, not because of fire, but because of bureaucratic perversity, in my view, and in the wake of years of reductions in arts funding, not just from government, but a lot of the private sector donations, the sources of funding that the arts community gets from the private sector have been squeezed as well because of the economic circumstances. A lot of this doesn't necessarily flow from government causes, but the responsibility falls to government to respond to that, to make sure that we're investing in our arts community and to make sure that we're giving leadership to the revival of a geographic community as well in the vicinity of the School of Art. Once again, I'd like to close by thanking the committee for their work, but urge the government not to feel that it's being blamed for any of this, but to recognise that it has a responsibility to give leadership in where we go next.
We move now to the open debate. Speeches of 6 minutes, please. Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Adam Tompkins.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I start by thanking Joan McAlpine for leading this debate on behalf of the Culture, Tourism and External Affairs Committee, of which I'm a member. And I know that, but for a family bereavement, the local member, Sandra White, MSP, would also be participating in this debate on behalf of our constituents. I too was deeply saddened to hear about the first fire at the Glasgow School of Art back in 2014. Everyone knows if you want to see something beautiful in Glasgow, all you have to do is look up. You'll be greeted by grand old buildings with beautiful ornate facades. Now, I wouldn't necessarily count the MAC as having been one of the prettiest pieces of architecture, but it was undeniably striking, groundbreaking, and of huge significance to the city of Glasgow. I was, of course, also shocked when I heard it was ablaze again in 2018, and I'm sure everyone else shared that emotion. Losing one of Charles Rennie Mackintosh's most iconic buildings, if not the most iconic, is a real blow to the history and culture of Glasgow and Scotland. While it may seem dramatic to call a fire with no human casualties a tragedy, thinking of such a beautiful listed building being gutted not long after its 150th anniversary, with refurbishments after the 2014 fire so close to completion, it's hard not to feel sad. Undergraduate students were set to have access to the new building earlier this year, and this was taken away from them. Given these two catastrophic fires, a public inquiry is absolutely essential. The GSA board has failed to act as custodians of this magnificent building or even act as good neighbours to local residents and businesses whose lives have been turned upside down. Insufficient priority was given to fire prevention, and we cannot allow such a disaster to happen again anywhere in Scotland, including if we built a rejuvenated Glasgow School of Art. Of course, the real question is this: how can we prevent this from happening again? It doesn't help that buildings under construction tend to be more vulnerable simply because a lot of construction, or reconstruction in this case, involves something called hot work, meaning the use of flames. The 2018 Primark fire in Belfast, for instance, was caused by a blowtorch which was left on, destroying the £6 million refurbishment of a 200-year-old building. How this cannot be the case for the School of Art, simply because no such works were taking place at the time. We all know that the blaze in 2014 started in a studio and was accelerated by voids and ventilation ducts in the building that allowed it to spread up towards the library. These voids, empty spaces such as in the roof that simply allow for natural ventilation, were pointed out after the fire in 2014 and had previously been noted as a potential issue during inspections in 1997 and 2006. Why was nothing done about them in the refurbishment post-2014? Another aspect of the most recent art school fire is how fire safety measures such as a sprinkler system were available but not yet in use. In March of this year, the committee heard evidence from fire expert Stephen Mackenzie and conservation architect Dawson Stelfox regarding the 2018 event. In that session, I quoted a School of Art spokesperson who in the Times that very day said, and I quote, "As regards having a working mist suppression system at the time of the fire, there is no such system that could have been operational in the MAC prior to the completion of the build phase." Mr Mackenzie rejected this vehemently, and Mr Stelfox responded that temporary suppression systems were indeed available. Perhaps an even greater shame is the decision to change the then almost complete high-pressure mist system to a low-pressure one between April and August of 2016. Although the reasoning behind it appeared sound, citing the dangers of high-pressured volumes of water on such a historic building, had the system been functional, the damage to the School of Art may not have been anything like as extensive. In terms of how the GSA board has reacted to this, there are deep concerns about their approach to openness, transparency and the wider ways they present and share information. Indeed, when the committee published a report, the response from the GSA board, if I'm being diplomatic, was, to put it mildly, utterly dismissive. There's a clear sense from stakeholders' evidence that the level of information and transparency around the consequences of both fires had been far from ideal, leading to unnecessary speculation. While some measures were seemingly taken by the GSA, such as much of the information was not easily accessible on their website and only available on request. For example, the GSA's website includes clear information about the restoration project itself, but not the governance and decision-making processes underpinning much of this work. Going forward, the GSA must review how it publishes information concerning the Macintosh building in order to provide a clearer picture of its activities. Of course, we must all await the outcome of the fire investigation into the events of last June before agreeing the next steps on the lessons to be learned. And I'm sure many of us are frustrated that it has taken some 15, 16 months already, and we would like to see that report, a comprehensive, detailed report, obviously, as soon as possible. However, it is clear that there must be more transparency regarding the processes which will be put in place regarding any future rebuild of the Macintosh building. Presiding officer, it's no exaggeration to say that the Glasgow School of Art fires have marked the city of Glasgow and indeed most particularly the community that surrounds it. It affected staff, students, Glaswegians and reverberated beyond. I must not forget the extensive damage caused to the A2ABC music venue next door, as well as already been mentioned, people's homes and nearby businesses. Perhaps a modicum of goodwill will come out of this fire in the form of awareness and robust measures put in place to ensure it never happens again, which is ultimately what we all wish to see.
Adam Tompkins, followed by Annabel Ewing.
I'm really grateful for the opportunity to take part in this debate, and I commend the committee for its work and for its report. Presiding officer, I called for a full public inquiry into the fire at the Glasgow School of Art in February of this year, 1 month before the Culture and Tourism Committee published its report. And I was, of course, delighted to see the committee echo my call for such an inquiry in its conclusions and recommendations. We need a full public inquiry for two reasons. First, to establish beyond doubt what happened in June 2018 when the Macintosh building burnt down for the second time in 4 years and why it happened. And secondly, and every bit as importantly, to come to a view as to what should happen to the building in the future. Now, the Culture and Tourism Committee has done excellent work in identifying a whole series of unresolved questions, but we now need a properly empowered public inquiry to answer those questions. Questions concerning the management and oversight of the MAX restoration by the School of Art, by the principal contractor Kier Construction and by subcontractors, and questions about whether, appropriate fire safety measures were implemented following the 2014 fire in the same building. The Culture and Tourism Committee could not get to the bottom of these issues for a variety of reasons beyond its control. Key information remains hidden from the public despite the committee's work. Minutes of School of Art board meetings have been redacted, as was the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service's report into the 2014 fire. And principal contractor Kier Construction declined to disclose to MSPs on the committee a key document unless it was withheld from the public. A public inquiry would, as Rachel Hamilton pointed out in her remarks, be able to compel the disclosure of information in the same way that a court of law can in normal civil proceedings. Now, among the key questions that we need an inquiry to answer are the following, Presiding Officer, and this is not an exhaustive list. First, the 2014 fire was put out quickly once the fire brigade arrived, but it had already spread to the top floor by the time they arrived. In June 2018, the fire brigade arrived on the scene within minutes of the alarm being raised, but by the time they got there, the whole of the Macintosh building was ablaze, from top to bottom. SFRS have said that the 2018 fire must have been burning for between 45 to 60 minutes before the alarm was even raised. For an hour before the alarm was even raised. How was this allowed to happen? Second, between 2008 and 2012, the Glasgow School of Art spent £8.5 million of public money, of Heritage Lottery Fund money, but not on protecting the vents, which others have already talked about, which were critical in accelerating the spread of the 2014 fire. Why was this? The Culture and Tourism Committee was told that in 2018, the GSA appears to have had one health and safety officer for the whole of its estate, not just for the Mac building, and no dedicated fire officer. Is that true? Regarding the Kier reconstruction work, why was there no compartmentation which would have helped stop the spread of the 2018 fire? And if there were people trained to inspect for fire 24/7, as there surely should have been, where were they on the night of the fire, given that it was ablaze for an hour, up to an hour, before the fire crews were called? Apparently, the fire and emergency plan set out that there was a guard on site overnight and that there was 24-hour security monitoring. So why, in June 2018, was no alarm raised until the fire had been burning for an hour? And finally, when asked by MSPs on the Culture and Tourism Committee, Kier could not confirm, as we've already heard from Pauline McNeill, that the fire alarm system had not been switched off in June. This is absolutely extraordinary. There had been dozens of false alarms in March, April and May, but none in the 3 weeks prior to the 2018 fire, and apparently no sound of an alarm on the night of the fire. So what explains this? These are just 5 of the questions that we need answers to, questions which have been identified by Joan McAlpine's committee, but not yet answered. Presiding Officer, 2 parties come out of the disaster of the 2018 fire particularly badly. The first is the GSA itself, and the second, I'm afraid, is the SNP administration at Glasgow City Council. The past 18 months have, as Pauline McNeill set out graphically, been profoundly difficult for the businesses and residents of Sauchiehall Street and Garnet Hill. They have been pushed to breaking point through no fault of their own, and I have been, like many others, have been deeply struck by their resilience and their tenacity. There was an alarming lack of a coherent, joined-up plan from Glasgow City Council to deal with the consequences of the art school fire last year. Piecemeal information trickled down to traders and residents in the days and weeks following the fire, and it was clear that the council was constantly on the back foot. 18 months on, there's still no long-term strategy for the recovery of Sauchiehall Street. No one blames the council for the fires, but at a time of crisis, it seems that Susan Aitken runs an administration which runs for cover when the going gets tough. SNP councillors right now seem more interested in spending taxpayers' money on shoes for themselves than on helping Sauchiehall Street and Garnet Hill recover. As for the School of Arts Management, they are even more culpable. Under their stewardship, Charles Rennie Mackintosh's jewel has been allowed to burn down twice. The School of Art, Presiding Officer, has straightforwardly failed in its custodianship of what is a national treasure. And I say to the Minister, don't allow them to pull the wool over your eyes. Since the 2018 fire, GSA management have behaved with appalling high-handedness and arrogance towards local residents, with callous disregard towards local businesses, and with dismissive disdain towards members of this Parliament and other elected politicians. They are not fit to run the School of Art. They are obstructive and secretive. They are rotten neighbours. They lack any sense of civic duty and responsibility. And in my view, Presiding Officer, the Mackintosh building and its restoration should be taken away from them. And Charles Rennie Mackintosh's glory should be rebuilt, not as a private art school, but as a public asset for us all to enjoy, indeed, as a magnet drawing tourists from all over the world to Glasgow to celebrate the crowning achievement of one of our finest ever artists.
Annabel Ewing, followed by James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a member of the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee, I am pleased to have been called to make a contribution to this afternoon's debate on our committee report entitled The Glasgow School of Art Mackintosh Building, the Loss of a National Treasure. And can I say at the outset that for all members of the committee across all political parties, and we did approach this on a non-partisan basis, and I'm a bit disappointed in the tone of Mr Tompkins, but that's up to him. But on a cross-party basis, what we felt in the committee was an incredible sense of loss, and that underlined our work. And this incredible sense of loss has been our key motivation in examining what has happened and what must happen going forwards to ensure that lessons are learned. Presiding Officer, I would wish at the outset to take the opportunity to thank the committee clerks for all their sterling work in producing this very comprehensive report, which was published on the 8th of March 2019. In our report, I believe that we have set forth fairly the evidence received and have reached conclusions and recommendations without fear or favour, and that indeed is as it should be. And the key recommendation we have made, that has been referred to already today, is that the government should establish a public inquiry once the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service has concluded its own investigation. I'm pleased to note from the Minister's comments today that that has not indeed been ruled out. And this need for a public inquiry is quite clear, given the significant number of disparate and important strands covered by our report, both as far as the MAC building itself is concerned, but also as far as wider issues that have been raised about historic buildings and national treasures in general are concerned. And indeed, it became quite clear that we need to look in this regard at the role of Historic Environment Scotland, both in general terms and also in particular in the context of restoration works. Regrettably, in the case of the MAC, there appears to have been an arm's-length approach. This was not a help. Turning to the Glasgow School of Art Board, the custodians, indeed, of this most precious of buildings, it has to be reiterated again that they presided over not just one, but two catastrophic fires. The first on the 23rd of May 2014 and the second on the 15th of June 2018. And the obvious question that indeed arises is what lessons did they learn after the first catastrophic fire? In fact, the committee did its best, Presiding Officer, to ascertain exactly that, but there was sadly a lack of clarity. And indeed, it was very difficult, for example, to get to the bottom of why a water mist suppression system had not been fully installed by 2014, even though it had been agreed to proceed with such an installation in 2008. And as we have heard, it was stated by the GSA board that fundraising needed to be carried out, albeit it is not clear also why the non-core Scottish Funding Council sums of, I believe, around £198,000 per annum, awarded apparently for heritage purposes, could not have been used. And how, in fact, was that money spent? Did it go towards perhaps the purchase of new buildings rather than for heritage purposes? These matters are not clear and must be clarified. It was also stated that aside from the fundraising issue, it was subsequently discovered only in July 2013 that there was a problem with asbestos, which required to be dealt with prior to installing a water mist suppression system. Again, the question arises as to why this key fact was discovered so late in the day, given fundraising for the project had commenced in 2009. Surely there should have been a full technical survey conducted when considering the project to determine as a matter of fact what needed to be done. This then would have informed the decision as to the amount of money that would need to have been raised. Questions also arose as to whether proportionate measures were taken with regard to risk management by the board. Questions also arose as to transparency of information available, including the itemisations of items lost in the collections in 2014 and 2018, the value of each item, and so forth. And in this regard, questions also arose as to the relevant insurance cover in place. And I had asked at committee for a copy of the current insurance policy to be made available. And whilst the GSA said in committee that, and that on the 15th of November, that they would do so, they subsequently refused to make this policy public. So we have no idea what cover is in place, what conditions are set forth with regard to the cover, what the value of the cover is, and whether the policy will be paid out, and will it be paid out in full, and when will it be paid out. This is simply not acceptable, Presiding Officer, not least as the public purse paid for the cost of the insurance premiums. In conclusion, it is, I believe, indeed vital that we get to the bottom of all of this, for the MAC was, as we have heard, not just a national treasure, but it was of very significant international importance. And, Presiding Officer, in examining the facts that we have been able to unearth thus far, it is really very difficult to see how it would be possible going forwards for a sustainable position to be that the dual purpose of the MAC as a functioning art school and as a museum could continue. Indeed, calls have been made that the MAC be set up under a public trust, and it is very difficult indeed to see, even with the facts available to us today, how that position is not preferable to the current status quo. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
James Kelly, followed by Tom Arthur.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to take part in this afternoon's debate, and I thank the committee for the important work they've done in this inquiry to highlight such key issues in relation to both fires, in relation to the Glasgow School of Art. I recall in May 2014 leaving a meeting in Bath Street, Glasgow, and heading up towards Sauchiehall Street. It was a lunchtime, and the smoke was beginning to fill through the sky, and people were shocked and a bit in fear as to what was happening. And they became even more shocked later when it became apparent that the Glasgow School of Art was in fire, such an iconic building. That shocked many, as many of the colleagues have said in the debate. And imagine that how that shock was amplified 4 years later. Again, I found myself in Glasgow city centre returning from a social event on a Friday night, and I dropped somebody in Sauchiehall Street, and you could sense there was a bit of commotion. But by the time I drove home, it was all over the news that the art school building was again on fire. You know, twice in 4 years, no one could quite believe it. And therefore, the committee inquiry work is very important. However, you get the sense that the work the committee have undertaken has been hamstrung slightly because of the lack of report from the Fire and Rescue Service. And I think it's absolutely crucial that that report is completed as quickly as possible. And there were calls for that to take place in June of this year when Pauline McNeill held our members' debate. And, you know, 4 months down the line, we still await that. And I think that's an important piece of the jigsaw. There's no doubt that people have highlighted on the role of the Glasgow School of Art, and I think that is absolutely correct. I mean, it's astonishing that the report underlines the fact that at the time of the 2014 fire, there were fire risks associated with that building. It's absolutely astonishing that the mist suppression system, which was identified in 2008 as being necessary to give protection from fire, wasn't fully installed by the time of the 2014 fire. And it's also equally astonishing that come the 2018 fire, on the night of the fire alarm wasn't working. As Pauline McNeill said, you know, that beggars belief. And those issues alone there are a lot of other issues covered in the report. Those issues alone raise serious questions about the management of the Glasgow School of Art. You sense, looking at the report and also at the Glasgow School of Art's response, that they're a bit prickly in terms of the criticism, but you've really got to ask the question, such large fires in 4 years and a catalogue of errors, of mismanagement, it's time that somebody took responsibility and stood up and was counted. I think, as Patrick Harvey highlighted, and also Adam Tompkins, who both, along with Pauline McNeill, have done a lot of good work on this issue in Glasgow, they've all highlighted the fact that the local community continues to be left in an isolated position as a result of the fire. The 2018 fire really devastated a lot of the businesses around the Sauchiehall Street area, and some people were moved from their homes and split up from their families. And there remain concerns about the real kind of lack of support, and also the lack of engagement from the Glasgow School of Art. I was struck by the contribution Patrick Harvey made in talking about the resident that in 28 years hadn't had any engagement, with the art school at all. I think that shows a real failure of public responsibility. So I think there are multiple issues here, and that's why members and the committee are right to call for a public inquiry. That public inquiry is necessary because we still don't know properly why these fires happened in 2014 and 2018, and there are clearly important lessons that have got to be learned from these incidents. I think there's serious questions about the role of the GSA. They've been severely criticised in the report and also in some members' contributions, and the public inquiry needs to look at that. And I think there also has to be an examination of how we protect other historic buildings throughout Scotland to ensure that there aren't any fire risks there. So in doing that, I hope that the government would take on board these calls for a public inquiry. And I also think the government need to be a bit more proactive in terms of looking at the role in relation to other historic buildings, but also for the Glasgow School of Art. The government do have a responsibility here. So in summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, I think there's been an important body of work that the committee has carried out, but it's by no means the end of the matter. There are a lot of questions that remain unanswered. We need a public inquiry, and we need an identification from the Minister of what action the government are going to take to address the serious issues that have been identified here this afternoon.
I call Tom Arthur to be followed by Annie Wales.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this debate, and I would like to put on record my thanks to the committee and the clerks for producing this substantive piece of work. I found it a very informative piece of work coming to as a non-committee member. However, before turning to the substance of the report, I would like very briefly to reflect on a previous jewel in Glasgow's architectural heritage that was lost to fire. This past Saturday marked 47 years since Glasgow lost St Andrew's Hall. Now, I don't think there's many people perhaps in this chamber who would be familiar with St Andrew's Hall or even its history, but it was one of the premier music venues, not just in Scotland and the UK, but in Europe. It had legendary acoustics. It was home of the Scottish National Orchestra, and it hosted some of the greatest musicians of all time, from Dame Nellie Melba to Sergei Rachmaninoff, and it also hosted some of our most significant political figures, including David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill. Now, I raise this as it was lost to fire following a boxing match between Scotland and Romania. Smoking was prohibited. However, those working at the venue were lax in the rules. They did not want to tell boxing fans that they couldn't smoke. And as a consequence of that, a cigarette ignited material which burned the venue down. Now, the venue, only a facade remains today, but it stands as part of the Mitchell Library complex at Charing Cross. And the reason the Mitchell Library stands today intact is because of a firewall between St Andrews Hall and the Mitchell Library that was put in place during the Second World War. And I raise that because it raises two questions about the application of rules and appropriate measures of mitigation, which have been raised within this piece of work. And it is tragic that some 42 years after that initial event, another jewel should be so severely damaged, and then following that, almost completely destroyed. And the fire at the art school, of course, came only 10 years after what was the Elgin Place Congregational Church, known to my generation as the Shack nightclub, was burned to the ground in Pitt Street. And it raises a question of how is it we have managed to find ourselves in a situation where these architectural gems, so interwoven with what it is to Glaswegian identity, should be lost? Why is it that these lessons over half a century have failed to be learned? A question arises that perhaps there's always going to be an inevitability that such tragedies can happen. But my reflections from reading this report is that the events that have befallen the School of Art in Glasgow were ultimately, to some degree, preventable. But when reading of regards to the conduct of many of those involved in the management and running of the art school, the report fills me with a foreboding sense as I make my way through it, because it seems that there was an inevitability in what eventually happened. And that is a great tragedy, because I ask myself, as someone who was born 23 years after the St Andrews Hall burned down, what would it have been like to have been there in this incredible venue? And I wonder for people born today, 23 years from now, what they will ask. What would it have been like to visit the Macintosh building? I appreciate there are calls to rebuild. I think they are valid calls, and clearly I agree with the committee that this has to be done in consultation with both the local community and wider stakeholders. I think the point that Patrick Harvey raised about the need to build trust before encountering a crisis is a lesson for us all, but we certainly do have a job now to restore trust and to build trust. And I think a key way of doing that will be to have that thorough engagement and not to take any decisions preemptively on what the future of the site should be. I don't endorse the position that Adam Tompkins took, but I think the anger that he expressed is an anger that is visceral and reflects the anger of many of his constituents, and I can recognise that entirely. So I say it is imperative that there is a substantive process of engagement. So many of the contributions this afternoon have focused on the need to ask questions, and so much of this debate is ultimately contingent on and caveated by the need to wait for the outcome of the SFRS inquiry. And I think while it is frustrating that we do not have a report yet, what is most vitally important is that the SFRS and all involved have the opportunity to conduct the most full and robust inquiry so that we have a full understanding of the events that took place. I am very sympathetic to the calls for a full public inquiry. I think what would be most beneficial, however, is to wait until we have the full results of the inquiry from the SFRS before proceeding forward. But by whatever mechanism we achieve it, it is imperative that lessons are learned from the events of 2014 and 2018, and that we ensure that this never happens again, because while there may be some questions about who the future legal owner of the Macintosh building should be, the reality is that they belong to all of us and to future generations too, and we are duty-bound to protect them. Thank you.
Colin Annie Wells, to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Shortly before summer recess, I spoke in the members' debate that marked 1 year since the Glasgow School of Art fire. It was last year on June 15th that this iconic building tragically caught fire. And as we've heard, this was the second fire to hit the building in just 4 years. and 1.5 years later, both the building and surrounding area are still feeling the effects of the very extensive long-term damage. The fact that this topic has been brought back to debate goes to show how important the Glasgow School of Art is to the people of Glasgow. Designed by one of the city's biggest icons, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, between 1896 and 1909, the Mackintosh building quickly became a well-established landmark in the city. It goes without saying that due to the architect's lasting legacy and influence within the city, Mackintosh and Glasgow remain synonymous as ever. And it's with that sentiment that we must do all we can as parliamentarians to assist plans on the building's long-term future and move forward with some of the recommendations made in the committee's report. On the one-year anniversary, it was very clear that locals were still experiencing problems associated with the fire. The resultant blaze engulfed several buildings, including the O2 ABC and several local households and businesses. Due to the cordon put in place, some businesses had to relocate, with some reporting losses of up to 75% on the previous year. Local residents expressed their frustrations too over issues like vehicle access, refuse collection and insurance claims that had to be made. And many felt that they were dumped back in their homes and just expected to go on with it and then subsequently shut out of planning for the regeneration of the area. There are a number of issues which still remain. Firstly, deciphering who was at fault for the fire and what can be taken from that for lessons for the future. The current inquiry is, of course, still in its final stages. Earlier this month, it was revealed that the report identifying the cause of the second fire would not be published until next year, which, although partly understandable given the complexities of the investigation, will be disappointing for people in Glasgow who now just want answers. The committee did note concerns with regards to the GSA's stewardship of the building in its lead up to the fire in 2014. It stated it was not convinced the GSA gave sufficient priority to safeguarding the Mackintosh building and that serious consideration should be given to placing the Mackintosh building in a trust in the future. This, of course, leads to the committee's recommendation to establish a public inquiry with judicial powers into the 2014 and 2018 fires at the Glasgow School of Art. And as I stated in the last debate, I support this call. As we've heard, it would compel the disclosure of information in the same way that a court can compel the release of documents in civil proceedings. There have been serious concerns raised over key documents being hidden from public view and questions about the management and oversight of the restoration by the Glasgow School of Art. This is supported by the committee, which expressed its desire for the GSA to be more transparent about what was lost from the Mackintosh collection in the 2014 and 2018 fires, as well as the governance of restorations. There have, of course, been further developments since the committee published its report in March that have shown further causes for concern. There have been further resignations within the executive team, which follows an exodus of 70 staff from the school since the second devastating fire last year. Concerningly, it was recently reported that 1 in 3 staff at the school feel unduly stressed at work, with 1 in 8 feeling harassed or bullied. It's clear that staff morale is extremely low, which, given the challenges ahead, is not a good place for the school to be in. Looking at what happens next and the restoration of the building, the public will not be encouraged by these reports, nor will it be by recent reports that a substantial amount of money, over £1 million, was spent in trying to relocate students to a building that has now been branded obsolete. Yes.
John McAlpin.
Thanks. She quite rightly cites some of these reports, and will she agree with me that some of the investigative journalism done by the Sunday Post and the Times newspapers has been very useful in this regard?
Annie Wells.
I would absolutely agree with Joe McAlpine on that point. But we need to know whatever happens next, public confidence will need to be restored. Once the outcome of the fire inquiry is known, the public will, of course, also want to know what is happening next, whether whether it to be rebuilt at the same site or moving to another site altogether in the area. Questions will also be asked whether it's built as a working arts school or whether it should be a public asset for the city. I sincerely hope that we can find a way forward soon. And to finish today, Presiding Officer, we must all redouble our efforts to ensure that we can move forward from the horrific events that shocked the city on 2 separate occasions. The inquiry must provide the answers that ordinary Glasgow residents and businesses have been asking for. Only then can we start to restore confidence in how the Glasgow School of Art is operating. That is the least that they deserve. Thank you.
And the last of the open debate contributions is from Stuart McMillan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I support this report, and as one of the committee members, I found the inquiry to be both saddening but also fascinating. Now, I've got no direct link at all to the art school, so I looked at the evidence from a purely dispassionate position. I do have some family links, but they are quite distant in the family tree. Now, I am aware of constituents who are genuinely saddened by the 2 fires, and they want the art school to be rebuilt. There is the understanding and the appreciation, however, that this will not be an easy task to achieve. Now, like colleagues, I want to highlight and also stress the point that the Fire Service Investigation Report hasn't yet been published, and any suggestions of people claiming that they know what happened should be treated with some scepticism. Now, on the report itself, now, the timeline on page 7 for me was actually very important. It provided just a simple and quick-to-read background history of the last 20 years or so regarding the Glasgow School of Art. But for many people, there will be the anger that second fire happened, particularly so soon after the first. There will also be the anger at the quantum invested by the many donors and also organisations, only to see it go up in smoke. Now, people clearly want the Glasgow School of Art to be rebuilt, but they also want it to be safeguarded for the future. It was something that clearly didn't happen after the first fire. Now, this is where the conclusions in paragraphs 24 and 25 of our report, and in my opinion, are very important. Now, if we as a committee consider the evidence supplied by the board to be robust, I'm sure that our conclusions and recommendations would have been somewhat different. Also, our recommendations at the end of paragraph 53 concerns the compartmentation. The convener spoke of this issue in her contribution earlier on, and others have touched upon it too. Now, our conclusions and recommendations at the end of paragraphs 53 and also 63 are therefore really crucial, in my opinion, going forward. Now, clearly our committee has been hugely concerned about what happened at the School of Art. So protecting historic buildings for the future is vital. Now, our recommendation regarding Historic Environment Scotland and also the updated guidance is very welcome in this regard, and I genuinely appreciate the Scottish Government's response to this particular recommendation. Now, our final recommendation regarding the public inquiry is something that I wholeheartedly support. And colleagues from across the chamber have touched upon the public inquiry already. Now, I'm not an MSP who just calls for public inquiries at a whim, because they are expensive, they take a lot of time. But on this particular occasion, I believe that it's important that a public inquiry does take place. I'm sure after any type of public inquiry, I'm sure it will provide further clarity on past events, but also provide really important recommendations for the future. Now, every member in this chamber today will be able to point to buildings in their constituency or region that they believe have cultural significance in their particular parts of the country. Now, we will all understand the damage it will cause to the cultural offer as well as to the significant landmarks of our parts of the country. Now, this is why I believe that the public inquiry is absolutely crucial. Now, I know that how damaging it would be for my area that if we were to lose one or more of our really important buildings. And so I appreciate the anger and the frustrations that people have about the Glasgow School of Art in Garnet Hill. But for me, the one saving grace about these terrible events is that nobody lost their lives. Now, many people have had their lives hugely affected, local residents, businesses and students, and that's also been touched upon by colleagues already today. And gentlemen, it really is important that we thank these individuals for their patience, their perseverance, but also their determination to progress with their lives. But genuinely, and I say this to every single member, thankfully nobody actually lost their lives as a consequence of the speedy response of the fire service. I'm saying also this report is something I have been pleased to be a part of. But I would much rather that our committee didn't actually do this type of report and do this type of work. I would much rather we actually did something that was more positive. But it became apparent that after 2 fires in 4 years, we really had no choice, that we had to do this particular piece of work. Now, out of this sadness and the frustrations and the anger, I hope that this report actually helps prevent another fire, either at the School of Art or a fire in any other building of historical and cultural significance in Scotland. Now, members mentioned the fire alarm system, and I couldn't agree more with her comments around this. I mean, the lack of clarity as to whether the system was on or off is just ridiculous, to be brutally honest. I also believe, like Polly McNeill, there was a complete lack of leadership at the college. But I commend this report, and I genuinely hope that we as a parliament, and we certainly as a committee, never need to undertake this type of inquiry again. Because I would rather we did actually have a more positive focus as compared to looking at what clearly has been an absolute disaster for the Glasgow School of Art. Thank you very much.
We move now to the closing speeches, and I call Pauline McNeill for around 7 minutes, please, Ms McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to begin by acknowledging what Stuart McMillan said there, that fortunately no one lost their life in this fire, and that has to be acknowledged. And a committee report like this shouldn't have been necessary. But as I said in my opening speech, I actually think it's a really excellent report, and I think it has done a lot of service to the issue, and it has asked some burning questions that we still need to get answers to. Because I believe that the case for a public inquiry is well made. And listening to members around the chamber, if I wasn't convinced before, I certainly am now, that there are too many unanswered questions about what caused the fire and about the management of the school itself. And I wouldn't say it lightly, but I think the only way in which we're going to get to the bottom of this is to have a public inquiry. I listened to Annabel Ewing and her excellent contribution in some of the things that she pointed out. I mean, it's extraordinary. A public institution will not let the committee of this Parliament have sight of its insurance policy. Who do they think they are? There has to be a message going out here. It is not acceptable. We're not doing it to give ourselves something to do. We're doing it because it's our job to do it, to hold institutions to account and to show the general public that we're doing what we've been elected to do. And that in itself is a sad indictment. The fire itself, as Adam Tompkins says, in relation to the length of time that the building was ablaze before the alarm sounded. I mean, like me, I'm sure you've probably heard hundreds of rumours around that, dreadful rumours around that. This is why we need the fire report as soon as possible, because that is a mystery to most people. If you watch the time delay video, in fact, it was Tom Innes in a meeting that showed me this, and I hadn't seen it. So when you see the fire subside, within seconds, you see the O2 absolutely explode in a blaze, and no one can explain that. But we want to know why that happened. The management of the building that was meant to protect it from the fire, having had a warning in 2014, is extraordinary. Not knowing if the fire alarm system was on the night of the fire, and the fact that no one has been held accountable for this, to me, is one of the most damning things of the episode itself. And for that alone, heads should have rolled at Glasgow School of Art, that they could not tell the committee whether the alarm was on the night. I mean, it absolutely beggars belief. That in itself should be the subject of a public inquiry. Confusion around the fire plan and the fire suppression system. I mean, at every level, it's dysfunctional. But the dysfunctional nature of the leadership of Glasgow School of Art, I think Adam Tompkins spoke at length about it. We need to know if it contributed in any way to the management of it and the fire itself. We don't have answers as to why the director, Tom Innes, left, and he left under a cloud. Let's be under no illusion about this. He was, if you read the reports in the press and believe it, he was sacked, and we don't know why. 6 people signed a confidentiality. What was in those confidentiality agreements? Why are we not allowed to see that? The use of public funds, the most recent one, at £1.2 million on the Charles Oakley building as a temporary measure that they didn't need. But do they not think they're under any scrutiny? I mean, it's as if they don't think that anyone's going to question what they're doing. At the committee, I think it was Kenny Gibson that talked about this. Myself and Sandra White, who I know is not here, and she's done a lot of work on this, and she should be recognised for that. We asked Muriel Gray some direct questions, and she, honestly, to be fair to Muriel Gray, she did acknowledge, and I commend her for this, that there has been decades of poor relationships with the local community, and I'm glad that she said that. But I asked her directly. There are rumours that Glasgow School of Art intend to purchase a building in Sauchiehall Street as a frontage for the school. And I and others wanted to know where in Sauchiehall Street is that building that she's... Because people will want to have a say on that. There's not a lot of trust between the local community and businesses in the Glasgow School of Art. So if they're going to buy a building with the millions that they seem to have, I'd like to know what it is. And she told me that she didn't know. And I know for a fact it was the O2. They couldn't afford to get it. And it takes me on to what I think was an excellent speech by Tom Arthur about the importance of the O2 in all of this. I know it's a side issue in relation to getting to the bottom of what caused the fire. But it has been a devastating consequence to the local community and the music community in Glasgow, that we don't know yet whether the O2 will be rebuilt as a music venue. It's one of the things that I'm spending a lot of time at the moment talking to the owners, and I put on record my thanks to the officials at Glasgow City Council, not the leadership. And Adam is right about this. The officials, at least, are doing their very best to make sure that the O2 have open doors to put forward a design that is affordable and will be accepted by planners. So I think it's quite important to engage with that. If we're not able to restore the O2 in 3 or 4 years' time, if we lose that as a city venue, I think it will have devastating consequences for that part of Sauchiehall Street, not to mention the music community itself. As others have said, the future of Sauchiehall Street is still hanging in the balance. I think it was Patrick Harvey that said this. Yes, the Avenues project has been assessed to some degree. It's changed the balance. But the jury is still out as to whether or not... I've businesses that are still coming to me saying they just don't know if they can survive. I hope the fire service report is due. I don't know what ministers can say about whether they can ask questions about the timescale. It would be helpful to know in summing up if that's an appropriate question to ask. I conclude, Presiding Officer, by saying I think the role of ministers is critical in all of this. I mean, if we can't get answers as a parliament, if the committee can't get answers, surely to goodness that ministers with all their authority can get answers to some of the questions that we were unable to get. It's a public institution. And I just conclude on this. I just read in the last 5 minutes the Glasgow School of Art have announced 5 new governors. Now, I've read through who they all are, and they look like very good people. But really, this was an opportunity to maybe appoint somebody who could have represented that disengagement with the people of Glasgow, but no, they didn't do that. And they're also sending out a clear message to the committee's recommendation or the suggestion that it should be controlled by a trust. It is to me, it is a clear signal that they're saying, no, we will take control of the Macintosh. We've appointed 5 new governors. You can go away. Well, I don't know if they've learned any lessons. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, there must be a public inquiry. Can the Cabinet Secretary, in closing up, indicate how warm he is to that? I know you're going to say that you'll need to read the fire report, and I fully understand that. But could you give us an insight? What is your feeling towards it? I mean, I wouldn't argue for a public inquiry lightly. I know quite often we're too quick to jump on, let's have a public inquiry. I really believe we need one in this case. And I hope when ministers read the fire report that they can back it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I call Alexander Stewart to be followed by Richard Lockett. Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to close for the Scottish Conservatives today on the Culture, Tourism and External Affairs Committee debate on the Glasgow School of Art fire. These fires, as we've already heard, have been a catastrophe for Scotland and a loss of a national treasure. The School of Art has had such a prominent place in the hearts of the local people in Glasgow, but not just in Glasgow, across Scotland, across the United Kingdom, across Europe and across the world. Many people look upon that as an iconic situation and building, and that has been lost. As a member of the committee, I have been very interested to hear many comments today and some excellent contributions from members on this whole saga. And I commend and I congratulate the firefighters who did all they could to save the school during the fires. It is also salient to reiterate at this stage that the Scottish Conservatives have been calling for a full public inquiry since well before the committee report. Whilst for the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, it's them to determine whether the building met the fire safety standards. The Glasgow School of Art did not take the increased fire risk at the Macintosh building into account prior to the fire in 2014. And we on the committee also expressed concerns at the length of time that the Glasgow School of Art took to install a mist suppression system, which was agreed back in 2008, but not installed by them before the fire in 2014. We were not convinced that the Glasgow School of Art gave sufficient priority to safeguarding the Macintosh building, and that in itself is an absolute scandal. The School of Art must be more transparent about what was lost from the Macintosh collection in the 2014 and 2018 fires, and there are serious concerns about the scrutiny and governance of that restoration. It is immediately after the fire that we wanted to ensure that the City of Glasgow Council ensured that businesses and local residents were being looked after. And we've heard today that there are still concerns about that taking place on a day-to-day basis in the location. And I pay tribute to my colleagues, Adam Tompkins and Annie Wells, our MSPs in Glasgow, who have been working tirelessly. But I also know that Pauline McNeill and Sandra White and others across this chamber have been also doing that to try and work collectively to support individuals and residents in the community. Glasgow School of Art acted in its usual manner on a site when it came to the guardians of turning and the restoration of the fire. But however, the transparency that we've seen ensured that there was negative publicity. And that negative publicity, Presiding Officer, continues to be the case. Questions need to be asked. People have got some real serious concerns about what took place, what happened, and we still haven't had full reports. And I'm sure the Minister will go into that in his summing up. Now, as I said, we've had some very good contributions, and I want to speak through some of those today. Our own convener, Joe McAlpine, talked about the risks and the mismanagement of the fires, and also about the amount of money that the School of Art has received from the public purse. Fire safety risks were identified about the building back as far as 1990. And the asset has not been protected. And as I said before, there's still issues with reference to the local community. The Minister himself spoke about the shock waves that occurred when the fires took place and that lessons need to be learned. Well, that is dead right, Minister. Lessons do need to be learned and questions need to be answered because of the value of the School of Art for its students, but also for the economic life within Glasgow. My colleague Rachel Hampton spoke about the work that was lost to the school and also to the students, and also about the listed buildings and historic buildings should be protected, and that there needs to be a review that takes place to protect these valuable assets. That has to come out of this process. Pauline McNeill talked about the disbelief of things that are taking place, the catalogue of errors, this number of staff leaving, and these confidential clauses that required. And the public just want to know why. Why is there still, after all this time, so much secrecy, so much possibility of things not being told to the public? They deserve to be given the right to hear what is going on. Adam Tompkins once again spoke about the mismanagement of the fires and talked about minutes from board meetings not being seen, the public inquiry that requires to be talked, the $1.5 million worth of public money that's been spent. The problems with the fire alarm system, the false alarms that took place, and there's a great catalogue of all these false alarms, but there was none of that when the fire itself took place. My colleague on the committee, Andy Ewing, talked about the insurance policy. Now, that's a vital issue, and the difficulties that surrounded that. Now, is that policy fit for purpose? It would appear that was not the case. We couldn't get answers from the company as to how that situation was. Annie Wells spoke about the morale of the staff. In amongst all of this, we've had the members of the school and the staff of the school having to cope with all this bad publicity and questions being asked. The public have lost confidence in the school and in the board, and there have been a number of changes. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're confident in how things are going to go forward. So it's vitally important that all of these questions are asked. Presiding Officer, we feel that the Glasgow School of Art should give serious consideration to placing the Macintosh building in a trust, and that's been talked about already today. And the committee would also like to see the Scottish Government establishing a public inquiry with judicial powers into the 2014 and the 2018 fires at the Glasgow School. The Scottish Government, the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, Historic Environment Scotland should clarify and review fire safety procedures in Category A listed buildings. Finally, I would like to indicate that the Scottish Government review with regards to the legal protections of Category A listed buildings is well talked about and has been talked about being reviewed, and it's vital that we ensure that it does have some weight behind that and it is compelling and supporting owners to install fire safety measures within some of the buildings. Presiding Officer, this entire saga has been damaging to the cultural heritage of Scotland. There are many more questions to be asked of the board and the management of the Glasgow School of Art. And when they gave evidence at the committee, it must be said they were evasive and they were less than convincing in many of their answers. I commend the report and I thank all those who gave evidence and who have given of their time. But I am disappointed that when the report came out, the Glasgow School of Art chose to criticise the committee for its findings. Lessons need to be learned from this sorry saga, and it must not happen again. The only light of anything in this whole process was that no lives were lost, but that was potentially through the system and circumstances. They could have easily have had fatalities in these situations. This should never, never have been allowed to happen, and it should have been preventable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Stewart. I call Richard Lockhead before Claire Baker to close the committee.
Well, I would like to thank colleagues for their constructive and thoughtful contribution to this afternoon's debate. I think MSPs from across all the corners of the chamber have made very powerful and thought-provoking comments, and I'll certainly, as Minister, as I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary who's sitting next to me will, reflect upon these very important points. I think it's also important, just to put in the record, that my colleague Sandra White, the constituency member for the Glasgow School of Art, I'm sure would have been here today making a very forceful contribution on this subject, but as we all know, she cannot be here with us today for very understandable reasons, and our thoughts will certainly be with her this week. As Minister for Further Education, Higher Education and Science, my first obligation is naturally to ensure the highest quality learning experience for students in Scotland. So I am pleased that the Glasgow School of Art, despite the impact of these two dreadful fires that we've been discussing today, has continued to attract the brightest and best from across the whole of the world, while nurturing the best of Scotland's talent and contributing energy and passion to our vitally important creative industries here in this country. And as I said in my opening remarks, the Glasgow School of Art ranks in the top 10 art and design institutions in the QS World University Rankings for 2019. However, as Annabel Ewing said when she said that the committee was trying to come to terms with the sense and scale of loss, and indeed James Kelly spoke about when he was in Glasgow on the day of the fire and experienced at first hand the response of the public to the devastation. And I recall following it on social media when the news broke and couldn't quite comprehend the scale of the devastation as well. It is really important, therefore, that we do use this opportunity to learn lessons from these fires to help ensure that our iconic historic buildings are well protected as much as they can be. And having met Professor Kearney, GSA's acting chair, only yesterday, I do know, and I have to convey to the Chamber, that it's my firm belief that the board do agree very strongly. Now, members have referred to a number of recommendations to the Glasgow School of Art itself, including that it should consider putting the Macintosh building into a trust, review how it presents information on its website, specifically information relating to items lost during the 2014 and 2018 fires, be more transparent in its processes, particularly in relation to any rebuild of the MAC, establish formal methods of communication and consultation with the local community, and to undertake a full consultation exercise before deciding the future of the MAC. And the committee, in the body of its excellent report, also calls into question the school's approach to risk management, the capacity and expertise of the board, and the priority it gave to safeguarding the building, the length of time taken to install the mist suppression system, and the school's ability to articulate the lessons it learnt as a result of the 2014 fire. Now, there's a number of issues raised, and clearly I am not the Glasgow School of Art. I'm not responsible for many of these issues, and I can't respond to them all. I think some do have to be put in some context. Of course, we have to bear in mind the contractor had day-to-day control of the site, and the committee did acknowledge that the school had oversight arrangements in place at the same time for that. I think it was Patrick Harvey who mentioned not having access to the insurance policy. Of course, our understanding for the reason for that is that the insurers did not give their consent to release that because the claims are not closed, and therefore that was one of the reasons for that. So I'm just giving some context to some of the points because we don't know some of the answers at this stage to many of the issues raised. Now, the GSA, of course, is an autonomous body, and its board has responsibility for the strategic decision-making and ensuring operational efficiency. So it has responded to many of the criticisms, as we know, that have been laid today. It also has made clear its intention in principle to rebuild the Macintosh building and is committed to review how it disseminates and shares information, as well as appointing a dedicated community engagement officer to support its efforts to build trust with its neighbours. I very much recognise the concerns expressed by members across the chamber today about that need for trust, that need for transparency, and to give much greater focus to having a much more positive relationship with the local community. I just want to assure the chamber that during my meeting yesterday with management, a large part of our conversation was focused on that very subject, and they gave me many different assurances and guarantees that that's going to be much, much higher up the agenda moving forward, and they recognise the concerns expressed by local members and indeed, of course, the committee's report as well. And on the question of trust, or a trust, the board has been clear that the Macintosh building is core to what makes the Glasgow School of Art experience unique. And they see it not just as a building, as I said in the opening remarks, and as other members refer to, it's very much part of a teaching experience. It's a tool for teaching in itself, as well as being a building. However, again, the GSA have said that they will consider all options to the management of the building going forward. And I am, of course, aware of the genuine and widespread concern raised in the press and in public discourse generally about the various decisions made by the School of Art in the years since the 2014 fire as well. Again, it's not for ministers to preempt the outcome of the fire investigation or to form a view on the fire prevention strategies employed during the rebuild project. But as I've said before, there are some areas where we have to put things into context in terms of who was in charge of the site on a day-to-day basis when the second fire took place. There have also been some concerns around the use of public funding, and I do want to confirm that £5 million, as we know, was pledged by the Scottish Government in the wake of the 2014 fire to support GSA to restore the MAC building to its former glory. We also had an extra £750,000 that was provided through the Phoenix Bursary Fund to support up to 102 final year students to recreate their work as well. And as we know, £5 million was provided by the UK Government to purchase the Stowe building as well. But in terms of some of the debates that have been taking place around the funding, it is true that the restoration of the damaged West Wing was covered by the Art School's insurance. But in consultation with Historic Environment Scotland, the decision was taken to include the whole building in the restoration works to ensure the integrity and safety of building-wide systems and to ensure that the whole building was fit for purpose. Therefore, we as ministers are satisfied the GSA spent the money provided by the Scottish Government in the way it was intended, given the need to extend the refurbishment beyond those parts of the building that were damaged by the fire and covered by the insurance. I recognise that members are also concerned at the use of funds raised through public donations, and that was mentioned by a few members in the debate as well. I should say I understand that the Scottish fundraising panel is considering that matter at the moment in light of many of the reports in the media. So that is taking place just now. I have no evidence of impropriety whatsoever, but in response to the media coverage, that investigation is taking place. Therefore, there's nothing more that ministers can give in response to that particular concern at the moment. But of course, the committee's recommendations impact much more widely than simply in the Glasgow School of Art. As I mentioned earlier, Historic Environment Scotland statutory remit in relation to fire mitigation in buildings of outstanding special architectural historic interest will be considered by the Government and by ministers. And in addition, the agency will review and strengthen its guidance on the risks to buildings during conservation and renovation work and its technical guidance in fire safety management. Again, another feature of this debate is that many of the fires take place in buildings under construction. Therefore, that's a very vulnerable period, and that's why these issues are important and members are raising them. That's all important work to safeguard our heritage buildings in Scotland, and we, of course, have to take into account the findings of the Fire Rescue Services investigations once complete. So I think, given the time available, I'll just move on to the issue of the public inquiry, because quite clearly many members have forcefully made the case for a public inquiry. I will repeat, I said it before, that it is absolutely right that we absolutely await the outcome of those investigations that are underway before giving further consideration to the committee's recommendation to establish a public inquiry. As a government, we have not ruled out a public inquiry, but quite clearly there are many different factors to weigh up prior to taking any decision. But no decisions can even be contemplated until we know the detail of the Scottish Fire and Rescue Services investigations, because clearly that will provide a lot more information to enable us to take the right decisions moving forward. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I would urge all organisations with responsibility for the upkeep and preservation of our historic buildings in Scotland, of which we have many fantastic buildings, to take heed of the detailed and valuable findings of the committee's very thorough and powerful report. And I thank fellow MSPs again for their contributions today, in which I and colleagues in government will certainly reflect.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And I call on Claire Baker to wind up the debate on behalf of the committee.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As Deputy Convener of the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee, I am pleased to close this debate, and I would like to thank all members for their excellent contributions this afternoon. The value of the Mackintosh building cannot be underestimated. The importance of Charles Rennie Mackintosh to modern architecture and design is significant, and this stunning building was a remarkable fixture in the heart of Glasgow. People were devastated by the 2014 fire, and the footage from the scene was heartbreaking. To then, at the point of resurrection and rebirth, to witness a second fire, reported as more devastating than the first, was terrible. The shock of two fires and questions over how this could possibly happen is what prompted the committee to undertake this inquiry, to examine the overall management and custodianship of the Mackintosh building, to consider what lessons can be learned and what we can do to better protect Scotland's built heritage. Although not the focus of the Culture Committee's inquiry, we should not underestimate the human cost of these two fires. Our fire and rescue services responded professionally and passionately to both fires, but we can't underestimate the risk involved in tackling these dangerous and complex incidents. The loss of the O2 ABC as a venue is also a blow to the cultural life of Glasgow. And as Pauline McNeill's members' debate earlier this year highlighted, the 2018 fire has been extremely disruptive for residents and for businesses in the area, who have expressed to the committee their dissatisfaction with the approach of the art school. The 2018 blaze caused substantial disruption to the Garton Hill community, and many local residents and businesses were displaced for a substantial period of time. The convener, Joan McAlpine, and other members have this afternoon set out the concerns of the committee, which are significant enough for the committee to call for a public inquiry with judicial powers, following the conclusion of the SFRS report. Although the Arts School have questioned the conclusions of the committee remains convinced that there is a need for further analysis of what happened and why, and that a further level of scrutiny and expertise needs to be applied to the sequence of events which led to two catastrophic fires. Presiding Officer, at times the inquiry was challenging. We received contradictory evidence and as committee members we had to weigh the evidence that was received and identify the areas where we believed there are concerns over the way in which the Macintosh building was left vulnerable to fire. There are measures that can be undertaken to reduce the risk to fire and most effectively limit the damage of fire if it happens. Glasgow School of Art sought to undertake a range of measures, but members this afternoon have highlighted the delay in installing a mist suppression system prior to 2014 fire, even though the risk of fire was evident. And while recognising the challenges of compartmentation in a historic building, questions can be raised over the level of compartmentation during the construction phase of the 2018 fire, which appears to have spread very quickly throughout the site. We await the SFRS report, but what we have learned during the inquiry does suggest that more could have been done on the construction site. As interesting as our report was and is, there is more to come following the publication. The committee received a lengthy response from Glasgow School of Art, which, in an attempt to counteract some of the concerns raised by the committee, also, in my view, managed to confirm some of the concerns of the committee. There are a couple of points I will make in relation to this. The 2014 fire was found to be accidental, and following the 2014 fire, the GSE agreed 5 key targets in relation to fire protection for the Macintosh building once it was returned to them and a functioning art school. Their 5 targets included improving compartmentation, installing a fire stopping in ducts, a state-of-the-art fire detection system, a water mist suppression system and a smoke extraction system. While these targets are all sensible measures, which arguably should have been applied to the building prior to the fire, I have concerns that they do not recognise the need for a cultural change in the approach to health and safety and fire prevention in the building. While the fire may be classed as accidental, there is no evidence that the GSE has reflected on the culture of the school or how to ensure the safe and appropriate use of modern equipment or materials in the school. The culture of the organisation is as important as processes and prevention measures. The focus on an individual student's mistake indicates a lack of considering whether the school is in any way responsible for the set of circumstances that enabled that mistake, which had significant consequences and risk fatalities. There have been reports of tensions between artistic expression and concerns over health and safety, between the purpose of the art school and the safeguarding of the building, and it's not good enough for the GSE to dismiss these concerns. The art school makes clear that the Macintosh building was compliant with relevant fire safety standards, and I don't doubt that it wasn't. They describe the mist suppression system as an enhancement, although, as we know, it wasn't installed for 2014. The focus of fire safety standards is protection of life, and I don't think they claim to be able to protect a Grade A listed building. The question is whether enough emphasis and priority was given to the protection of the building, and the committee was not satisfied that this could be demonstrated. Looking forward, the future of the Macintosh building is still to be decided, although GSA are so far resolute in its intention to rebuild. We should all recognise the uniqueness of Macintosh building. It is owned by Glasgow Art School, but it belongs to the country. The impact of both fires has again raised questions over the appropriateness of GSA having responsibility for the building. Are they the best custodians, given their other responsibilities, in running an internationally competitive art school? Thank you. While other universities and colleges
please just keep the noise down. Thank you.
Thank you. While other universities and colleges own A-listed and historic buildings, Glasgow is alone in having such a unique and valuable building as part of their working estate. It is a complex building, and while I don't question the value to the few students who get to work in there are questions over whether the use of the building is appropriate. The GSA defend the dual use of the school, but questions are raised over the amount of focus the school receives as part of its activities. The school generates strong passions. As architect Malcolm Fraser commented in his evidence to the committee, they were not looking after the jewel at the heart of their estate. That was the primary failure of Glasgow Art School, and many institutions do the same. They failed to care for the jewel at their heart. The idea that the MAC be placed in a trust is not a new suggestion, nor would it necessarily mean that students could no longer access the building. Furthermore, it would alleviate some of the burden placed on the GSA and could better prioritise the building's safety. The committee therefore suggests that the GSA give serious consideration to placing any future Macintosh building into a trust, perhaps once a new director of the art school has been appointed. The committee made a number of recommendations about the role of Historic Scotland, and I welcome the response we've had for the Cabinet Secretary for Culture to these recommendations. I do welcome a willingness to review this and to consider this and other points raised by the committee in relation to Historic Environment Scotland, and I hope the Cabinet Secretary for Culture will soon be in a position to update the committee on any progress. So I welcome the opportunity this afternoon for us all to debate the committee's report on the Glasgow School of Art fires. And it's clear from the discussion in the Chamber that there remain many unanswered questions which deserve further scrutiny, and the committee will continue to pay attention to this project as it goes forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and that concludes our debate on the Glasgow School of Art fire. Moving on to the next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 19832 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau setting out a business programme. And could I call on Graham Day to move this motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. No member has asked to speak on the motion. The question therefore is that motion 19632 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you very much. The next item is consideration of Business Motions 19625 on the Stage 1 timetable for a bill and 19620 on the timing of a Stage 1 debate. Could I call on Graham Day to move these motions?
A move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And no one has asked to speak on those motions. Therefore, the question is that motions 19625 and 19620 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The next item is consideration of 4 Parliamentary Bureau motions. Could I again call on Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau to move motions 19621 on approval of an SSI, 19622 on committee meeting times, 19623 and 19624 on designation of a lead committee?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. We're going to turn now to decision time. The first question is that motion 19553 in the name of Joan McAlpine on the Glasgow School of Art fire be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are all agreed. And I propose to ask a single question on the 4 Parliamentary Bureau motions. Does anyone object? No, that's good. The question is that motions 19621, 19622, 19623 and 19624 in the name of Graham Day be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you very much, and that concludes decision time. We're going to move on shortly to members' business in the name of Margaret Mitchell on Charities Scotland and Holyrood, but we'll just take a few moments for members to change seats.